of Outreach at the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare, also known as CASHU. Thanks so much for joining us. This webinar is a partnership with the Center for Practice Transformation, also located here in the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota, and it's funded through the School of Social Work at the university and the Title IV-E grant facilitated by the Minnesota Department of Human Services, with federal funding provided by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So this session will again be led by Steve Carlson, clinical trainer with the Center for Practice Transformation, and it'll be about an hour long with plenty of opportunity for engagement. I'm just going to run through a few housekeeping items and we'll remind you in the chat as well. So we will record this webinar, and we'll email it out to all registrants and attendees. We'll also post it on CASHU's website. One CEU will be emailed out to all attendees in the next week. There will be a very brief evaluation survey following this webinar, and we really encourage you to complete it. And then finally, we really encourage you to use the chat or the hand raising function. If you'd like to be anonymous, you can also use the Q&A, but as much participation as you'd like is encouraged. And now I think I'll let Steve take it away.
Thank you, Stacy, for that. Yeah, so good to be with you. Welcome to this second week, second Wednesday that we're talking about this whole area of self-care and taking care of ourselves as child welfare workers. Last week, we focused in on just getting a sense about what are the challenges that we face, the difficulties. And part of that was a statistic related to the turnover rate in child welfare services, that literally the turnover rates are anywhere between 20 and 40%, and as high as 65% for child welfare workers. And for trainees, for those of you that are new, and from last week, so many of you have been in this work for over 10 years, and I'm going to make the assumption that many of you are along this week that were here last week. I hope so anyways, because I'm going to have you continue your discussions about the things that you talked about last week. The feedback that we got from last week was that you loved the interaction and hearing from each other. And therefore, I strongly encourage your raising your hand and participating as we get to those moments when I'd just really love to hear from you. We also talked last week about what sustains you in this work. And several of you commented, Alan, you commented, if you're here, that the whole aspect of compassion, satisfaction was a significant part of why you stay in this work. And Sandy said the love of children and their sense of well-being was what sustains you in your work. And Jody, support for the support of colleagues and a helpful supervisor. And Kelly, being in a supervisor role and mentoring other people that are new in this field and encouraging work-life balance and that sense of privilege and honor of being in this role of a supervisor, as a guardian ad litem supervisor. So those were some of the things that sustained everybody in this work. And I'm going to just start my my PowerPoint here. The topic today is, how do we cultivate resilience? Using this beautiful but powerful phrase of, you cannot pour from an empty cup. Last week, some of the challenges that were pointed out in this work that can lead to burnout or compassion fatigue or even vicarious traumatization focused on these top 2 or 3 here, that the most challenging aspects of our work really are related to the system, to the court systems, to needing to redact information from our notes that because of some new laws a couple years ago around needing to make public our or at least make available our information, our documentation, and all of the work that goes into that. And honestly, the least was working with children or even with challenging clients. So these are the difficulties and the challenges that were identified last week. So for those of you that were not here last week, that's what we covered. And there was a lot of really great interaction around that. So today I'm going to do a brief mindfulness meditation, a 3 centers meditation. And then we're going to just briefly cover burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. My guess is that most of you know about these things and have experienced them. So I would like to just do a little bit of recollection, or what one of my teachers calls a recognition. That is remembering what these items are, what these challenges are, and the impact of this emotional labor of doing this work. And there will be a poll to ask about if you've experienced some of this, and some conversation, and again, sharing what you do to ward off compassion fatigue, burnout, and how do you manage vicarious traumatization, which is at least the exposure is going to occur. Whether we get traumatized or not is another question. And then cover a little bit about an idea around a safety and a self-care plan for how we might be able to take care of ourselves. So with that, I'm going to do a meditation, because this is an opportunity for you just to have a bit of a break from your work. And my hope is that you experience some sense of peace and calm with participating in this webinar. So this is a meditation that focuses on our 3 centers of intelligence, which are our head center, or our thinking center, our heart center or emotional center, and our body center or our sensing center. So I would just encourage you to let yourself settle into a comfortable position and gently close your eyes or soften your gaze as you become aware of your breath. And just breathe slowly and deeply. And perhaps you'd like to just simply focus on the cool glass of water on the screen, imagining this fullness is your heart, filled with a sense of peace and calm. As you breathe in and exhale, allow yourself to become more deeply relaxed. Now, gently shift your attention from your breath to your thoughts. What is on your mind? Perhaps you've already had a busy morning, many people you had to see, or even crises to manage, or responsibilities to take care of, some likely still undone. Maybe there's someone you are worried about. One of your clients is weighing heavy on you like a weight. Our thoughts sometimes have a life of their own, fueled by unseen energy and not easily quieted, and difficult to manage at times. Now, shift your attention to imagining yourself sitting by a stream on a late summer afternoon. Warm sunshine filtering through the branches of an expansive old tree that you're seated beneath. A few leaves riding a gentle breeze floating to the ground around you. Now, look up and see the reflection of sunshine dancing on the surface of the flowing stream. Likely there's just slight ripples of water against dampened rock. A few colorful leaves pass by slowly and effortlessly on their way to larger streams and rivers. Imagine these late summer days, well-seasoned leaves drifting by as they are just like thoughts passing through your mind, and simply observe them for what they are. There are probably all sorts of thoughts, worried thoughts, happy thoughts, maybe some very interesting thoughts or planning types of thoughts. Others might be just random and makes no sense at all kind of thoughts. All just thoughts. And you are the unconscious creator and now observer of those thoughts. You may not be able to control what thoughts enter your mind necessarily, but now you can step back from them and see them for what they are. Thoughts or information, ideas, sometimes beautiful, sometimes troubling. And this is the way it is with our head center. We process information and we learn through thinking. Now return back to your breath. And as you take in a deep breath, follow that breath down into your heart center, the realm of emotions and the richness of experience, such as joy and sadness, pride and anger, love and hatred, or shame and happiness. Notice what is happening in your heart center, the emotions rising from within. Now imagine again sitting by that stream beneath that large tree, and just ease your way back and gaze up into the blue sky. White billows of clouds dot the sky. If you are fortunate, perhaps an eagle catching the thermal winds will soar overhead. Just seeing this majestic bird in your imagination, what emotion does this evoke in you? A sense of inspiration, awe, a gratitude? It is here in the heart center where we experience a life force, an energy that inspires us to take in all of life, where we are moved forward toward meaning and our purpose in this life, toward the life we were born to live. Once again, return back to your breath and simply take in a deep breath and just hold it for a few seconds and then let it out slowly. Now ease your attention lower into the belly center, the place of intuition and the ground of our senses, the place of sight, of hearing, of seeing, listening. It's here in the body where heat and sound and touch and taste continuously gift us with awareness of what is happening in and around us, and settle into your deepest sense of grounding in the belly center. And as you take in one last cleansing breath, just imagine yourself again by that stream, your senses wide open, resting comfortably, allowing thoughts to simply pass on by as you observe them, and emotions pulsating with life energy in your heart center. And simply feel a sense of gratitude for these amazing bodies that are able to both to think and to feel and to sense. And as you just sit restfully, inhaling and exhaling slowly, when you feel ready, gently open your eyes and come on back into our common space here. I'd like to just start with a video. This is a video of four nurses, women who work, all four women who work in the physical health care industry. But they really speak to this idea about the emotional labor of working with children. And there are, as I said, there are four nurses that will be sharing a bit of their story around compassion fatigue and what they experience. First of all, there's Jenny, who talks about, she's a medical doctor who feels the need to be tough. or that within our industry in child welfare working, this need to be tough, and that it's sometimes very hard to ask for help. This sense of isolation that can happen with our caring. There's also a nurse from an emergency department. Her name's Trish, and she talks about how we tend to stuff things down. We tend to become real task oriented and sometimes miss out on that human side of providing care. She talks about some of her own vicarious trauma about a child that died in their care. Then there's Beth, who does clinical practice, and she talks about that we have to keep giving even when we feel we're on empty ourselves, and that the support is not always there. And we oftentimes take little time just for ourselves. And finally, another RN, her name is Chris. She talks about before entering into a room, knowing that there's going to be some anger, there's going to be pain, there's going to be suffering, how she prepares herself. And sometimes she'd rather not even go into that room, but she prepares herself. And she talks a little bit about how we need to sometimes limit how much we can give in order to be able to take care of ourselves. So I just thought I would play this and then talk a bit about burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma.
I feel very in touch with compassion fatigue awareness because it's a special interest of mine, just helping care providers take care of ourselves.
Instead of saying, I can give no more, we just continue to give.
Of all the things that I've experienced between myself or coworkers and realize, wow, that's what compassion fatigue is.
I think what people end up doing is they internalize it.
I think it's our culture to feel like we need to be tough.
You have to get through your shift, you have to get everyone else through the shift. So a lot of times you'll take whatever emotional turmoil you went through and stuff it down and pretend you'll deal with it later.
I can think of many instances where I paused at the door and said, can I think of an excuse not to go into this room? But that's not what this job is, and that's not really what we want to do. So you go into the rooms and you try to do the best that you can do.
And I think those people that need it the most are probably the least inclined to stop and say, I need help, this is hard.
There's always, the first death you ever experience. I can still remember, pulling a barrette out of this little girl's hair. It's those moments that put the humanness into it, because you think, we had done everything we could as a team to save this little life. And as we were cleaning her up to get her ready for her family to come see her, I find this barrette in her hair and I think, oh my gosh, somebody put that in her hair. That was her mom. I'm sure when she did that, she did not think that'd be the last time she ever got to do that. So that was 14 years ago.
I have a heavy heart. Yeah, I carry it with me. I think about it. I think about it when I'm going to bed at night.
I would never want to give that moment up. I think it helps turn you from a task-oriented provider to really focusing, when you can, to the humanness of it.
It's heartbreaking because I have two children, boys who are 6 and 7 years old. And it's very easy to quickly put yourself in the place of this parent and what they're going through. It's a difficult balance because you want to feel enough emotion and empathy and compassion and connect with what's going on with patients and their families, but not have it be so overwhelming that you can't do your job.
You know you're going into a room that there's either anger or pain or some sort of suffering that you don't know how to help with. And you do pause before you go into the room and say, can I, because you want to make a difference, and can I make a difference in this room? And you can't always make the difference that you want to make.
We see everything. It's hard to even communicate that at home to your spouse because they just don't understand what you deal with.
There's always an emotional attachment to wanting people to be better.
And we spend so much effort taking care of the patient and taking care of the patient's family, but we have very little time to take care of ourselves.
There is a limit to the amount of care you can give somebody else unless you take care of yourself fully first.
You're not validating what you did as a profession, which is amazing. We do amazing work.
So I want to give just a chance for observations or reflections on that. Anybody resonate with what was said around this, around the challenges in our work? I just want to give a chance for anyone to comment on that before I press on into information. I think it's in the stories that we tell that we actually begin to experience an understanding of the information around burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. There's a lot of information about it, and I'm quite certain that all of us have had plenty of workshops and information about what it is, but it's how it happens in the stories that where we really begin to understand it well. So here's a bit of information around this. This is just to review a little bit. The compassion fatigue compared to burnout, compassion fatigue is related to that internal factors of the desire to care. And as we talked about last week, one of the very things that provides satisfaction in this work, I think the term Alan used last week was compassion satisfaction, is that we gain satisfaction from doing the work and to see success, to see good things happen. And when we're in situations where it isn't good things that happen, those internal factors begin to wear on us. Whereas burnout is more related to the work tasks. And in many ways, the kind of work that you do that is the most challenging, as was identified last week, are things like dealing with court and dealing with having to redact notes. So these internal versus external factors. And so compassion fatigue is the strain from helping others. Chris said last week, there's always, or Chris, the nurse on the video said, there's always an emotional attachment to wanting people to be better. So it's inherent in the work that leads to compassion fatigue. So those are really the difference. In the poll that we all took last week, too much to do was 31% of the cause of somebody leaving child welfare services. These were some of the other comments that people had made. We talked about the court system being adversarial. It's just the nature of our work is that there is, and the judges who meet with our clients or kids or parents for 15 minutes a month or so, this kind of a system leads to the experience of feeling burned out. Kelly had mentioned that it feels like a grind. This work is a lot like it grinds you down. And I got to thinking of this metaphor of grinding us down, that there's sort of a coarse grind and there's a fine grind. And the coarse grind are things like the compassion fatigue and the vicarious trauma that we experience. But it leads to this even worse feeling of burnout, which, according to what I understand burnout, the way I've experienced it, it kind of sets in sort of slowly over time, don't even recognize that it's happening. And it leads to this sense of being feeling this sense of cynicism and emotional exhaustion. or feeling a lower sense of accomplishment, which is part of the reason we do this work, is because we feel this satisfaction from doing the work. And then also, Carolyn had mentioned that our hands are often tied. And I put this on here because I remember quite a few years ago, I was working as a child therapist, and I had this young person. He was 5 years old, and I was doing some play therapy with him, and he literally tied me up in my office, which was an important aspect of him feeling in control. But I remember feeling, tied up, and I felt very vulnerable with this 5-year-old, even though it was part of this enactment of his process in his healing. But this feeling of helplessness that happens with our hands being tied in many situations where we have little control over outcomes really takes a toll. And there are many factors in here. The organizational factors are the ones that were mentioned to be the highest. And so these over here, this organizational factors of high workload, not enough staff and resources, insufficient training, which is interesting that actually the rate of burnout amongst people that are new in this field is at the highest. Even 50% of people new in this field, trainees, will experience burnout. And part of that, as I understand, is because of the high expectations. When we start in this work, we have very high expectations of what we think that we can accomplish. This idealistic, I'm going to be able to save the world even. I recall in my younger years feeling this, I'm going into this and I'm going to make a big difference. And I know that it's important to remember that we do make a difference, but individually, probably not going to save the world. So all of these things around organizational factors are really especially significant based on what you all spoke about last week. But also this repetitive exposure to suffering and trauma over time takes its toll. And sometimes it literally, truly gets in. For example, Trish had mentioned this child with the barrette in her hair. That got in to her. 14 years later, she still experiences the emotion of it. And I think we call it allostatic load. It's the combined impact of daily tasks, of the vicarious exposure to various forms of suffering and trauma, and all of these other factors build on this allostatic load. And then the individual factors over here of high expectations. And it's important to remember our own personal history of unresolved traumatic experiences, the ACEs study, and most of us in the helping profession have at least one ACE score, if not more than that. And we're more easily triggered to the extent that we have not actually worked through all of that history. We experience a greater sense of impact. And this insufficient social support, Kristen Neff did research on compassion and on self-compassion. And one of the elements of that self-compassion is the ability to feel a sense of common humanity rather than isolation. Is that we tend to not just suffer in our work, but we sometimes suffer in isolation because we don't feel a sense of maybe a right to be able to share our own challenges, or it's very vulnerable to do so. I remember I was driving in St. Paul and happened to enter into a speed trap on 35E heading towards Lakeville. And I got pulled over. I was doing 70 and a 55. And so I'm pulled over. And if you've ever had the feeling of being pulled over on the side of the road, is this deep sense of shame. Like everybody's looking at me, I wonder what they did. What did they do? And I was just feeling that. But the best thing is that it was a speed trap with a number of squad cars. And so there were literally, as I looked up, there were 2 or 3 more people ahead of me who had also been pulled over. And it totally alleviated my self-consciousness, is because I wasn't feeling like the only one. I wanted to sort of like raise my fist in the air and we are the 99% or something. That sense of camaraderie with my fellow ticket getters was really helpful in being able to not feel so isolated in that. So these are the risks that we have around compassion fatigue and burnout. And here's that statement by Trish again. You know, I can still remember pulling a barrette out of this little girl's hair. That was 14 years ago. For the most part, we tend to bury a lot of that stuff because we have very busy schedules. And we don't always have a chance to process that through. What was it, Basil van der Kolk in his book, The Body Keeps Score? It stays in there until a moment when that memory is triggered by either another client or a life circumstance. And that need to process raw grief and trauma is critically important. I already mentioned this, that sense of emotional exhaustion, or that feeling where we get ground down, and the cynicism. Kelly, you'd also mentioned, if you're on the call, you had mentioned the sense of futility that can begin to settle in. Like, what we begin to feel like we don't have power or influence over the outcomes, and we don't. We can advocate like crazy. We can present our positions in court. We can share our ideas, but in the end, there's a lot that is outside of our control. And then the reduction in compassion satisfaction, because we don't feel like we're doing as good of a job. So I would like to do a poll here, and this will be the poll. And Nora, if you could put that out there, thank you. So here's the poll. I have experienced one of these, burnout, compassion fatigue, or vicarious trauma currently, but it's manageable. Currently, but it significantly impacts my work. Recently, past 6 months, but it still impacts me. Recently, past 6 months, but I've moved beyond it. In the past, but it's over 6 months ago, or I've never experienced any of these. So we've got about a little over half that have put their response in there. Thank you for responding. And so there we go. Almost just a few left. To give you another chance to fill this out, or to make your comment in there. All right, Nora, if you want to go ahead and publish these, let's just kind of take a look and share. So we've got 23% currently feeling the effects of burnout and compassion fatigue. And just one of you where it's significantly impacting your work. So sorry to hear that, but this is the reality. And I think according to this, 36% have experienced it in the past, over 6 months ago, and some more recently, and some that have moved beyond it. which is really good to hear, that there is a way to move beyond it. And there totally is a way to move beyond it. And that's what I would like to be able to address now. Next is how you have moved beyond it. I love this quote because I think it's very true. The heart is open to wounding by the virtue of caring. It is the nature of our work that we will experience compassion fatigue, we'll experience exposure to trauma, and very likely because of the repetitive tasks, particularly in child welfare work, where there's a lot is related to courts, administrative work, related to paperwork, things like that, is that we will experience the effects of burnout. I'm going to just, I think being able to access our emotions on this is probably the most important thing, not our head center, because we know this stuff in our head. But I'm just going to play another video. Many of you have maybe seen this before, but it's a video put out by Cleveland Clinic on empathy, and it really speaks to the nature of work, and that all of us, not only are we experiencing difficulties within work, but we all have stuff going on in our lives as well. So I'm just going to play this video. Let's see if I can. So I'm going to open this up to some conversation, but I think we all have our own ways that we deal with our own burnout. And these are some reminders, some things that I have found helpful around burnout, is to really to take a look at how much work do I have to do, and what is really realistic in terms of what I can do. And when I have too much to do, how do I take care of myself so that I can continue to do as much as I need to do, but also learn how to say no to some things or yes to some things. Sometimes yes to the social support or yes to the self-care. Finding time each day for my own self-care, whatever it is that I practice, whether that's exercise or mindfulness meditation, or it's a walk in nature. Walking barefoot on grass is very, very helpful. And taking time to do that. And then for many people, having some kind of transition from work to home, this is really difficult, especially with COVID, because those of us that work home quite a bit, there is no transition from work to home, and finding that kind of balance. And the other around, and I use the word resolving compassion fatigue in part because many of you acknowledged and said that you were at one time over 6 months ago feeling compassion fatigue or burnout or something, but no longer. The effects are no longer there. It is possible to be able to work it through. Some of the ways to do that are focusing in on the things that have worked well, the successes that we've had, or the positive results in our work. Back to this idea of what Kristen Neff describes as isolation versus common humanity. We all suffer. It's just part of what we signed, what it is to live is to suffer. And getting that kind of meaningful support and not isolating. The sense of self-awareness, including the impact of my own history and knowing my limits, is other things that we can do. So I want to just open this up. I would love to hear, and I think your colleagues would as well, what you do for those of you especially that have resolved your compassion fatigue. What do you do? And feel free to put it in the chat as well, what it is that you do to either prevent burnout and compassion fatigue, or what you do to be able to manage it as you begin to feel it, and that sense of awareness. Anybody willing to raise their hand and just share what you do to hear from each other? Thanks, Francine. Spending time with grandchildren. I would love to hear what you have to say about that. I have 3 grandchildren, and seeing the world through their eyes, the sense of wonder and awe is amazing. I give my 2-year-old a ball, and all we do is we just sit there and push the ball back and forth, and just to watch how she lights up is really, really life-giving to do that. Any other things that you do that sustain you? Go ahead, Kendrick.
I myself am a music guy, so that's one of the ways, and I do a lot of songwriting, so a lot of times that's a good way for me to kind of process some of the things that I'm dealing with. But I think kind of a more direct approach is really understanding that the people that I work with, there's a lot of capacity for them to show up in their own lives, and I'm not the end-all be-all, so really offering the piece of me that I know that I can show up, and knowing that that does come with a boundary in terms of how much I'm able to do, and not putting that burden on myself, if you will.
And what I love about that, Kendrick, is to be acknowledging the gift that you bring. I believe that when we acknowledge that we do have a gift to bring, and that it's what we have, unlike plumbers and electricians who have tools that they do their work with, we are what we bring is the healing qualities to it. And a lot of great comments. Nature and looking at plants, taking in nature through the senses. I recall once biking out at William O'Brien State Park over on the St. Croix, and I was hoofing it up a hill. And when I got to this spot, I just paused for just a moment. And as I was settling into that space, it took me a while, but I eventually noticed that there was a sound of grass just flowing in the breeze. And it took me several minutes to even notice it there because I had not been present to my own senses. So being out in nature, having a strict schedule of boundaries, thanks Holly for that. Learning how to shut off the computer or the cell phone. I did an experiment, a behavioral experiment on myself to see. I set my phone aside for an hour, and my experiment was, I thought, I'm going to get something that I need to respond to. There was like a 50-50 chance that something's going to come through that I have to respond to immediately. Well, after an hour, nothing came through that I needed to respond to immediately. There was this sense of crisis that I need to be on my phone, but I really didn't. Having transitions, thanks Ashley for that. Being confident that my decision to do that is important and okay. Right on. Take a 4-year leave from the county work that you did. That's beautiful, Connie. And been able to learn to separate work after hours. I think that's a challenge for us, especially those of us new to the work. Don't realize that I need to do this. I have to take care of myself. Book club, conversations with others, co-hosting a podcast. Wonderful, Charlie. Focusing in on the positives. Yep. Celebrate the small successes. Thanks, Julie, for that. Sit by water in silence. Beautiful. And reading and research. Thanks, Francine. Oh, working in the garden, getting my hands dirty. Wonderful. Excellent ways of self-care. Thank you for putting those into the chat. I have just a couple more things to say, and that is, this statement of it's an old Russian proverb. If you live close to the cemetery, you can't weep for everyone who dies. It almost sounds almost a little bit cruel in some ways because everyone needs to be wept over. But when you live close to the cemetery, how do we do that? I think there's a difference between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. And the cognitive empathy is a little bit easier than feeling the pain of others. We can imagine the pain, but not necessarily take it in to a great depth. I just was happened upon this morning. I'm not going to read through obviously all of these, but somebody had mentioned to recognize that the work that I do makes a difference. This second one here, to take pride in my work. Let me just underline this one, to take pride in my work and know that I am making a difference. Being able to do that, as somebody had mentioned earlier, is so important so that we don't lose that sense of I am making a difference, or what that particular quality of burnout is, that I no longer feel like I'm being effective or that I'm not being successful in what I do. So there's a couple other things just before we move towards closure. And this is one of the things that I do is it's this difference between a safety plan and a self-care plan. And so last week, somebody had mentioned that the stressful situation that they are under is when the judge sends a child home because it's Christmas. And we're going, wait a minute, that's not a safe place, but yet it's outside of our control. So on this far left side is this sense of stressful situation. And in here, there's a safety plan and a self-care plan. The safety plan is what we do in the moment, our ability to connect to what our core values are by taking a deep breath, whatever it might be, an intentional practice of awareness, a grounding exercise, honoring my emotions, being mindful, a brief walk in nature. So this is in the moment. When something happens, we have a plan for what to do in that moment. The goal of this is to be able to remain connected to our core values, which might be, from last week, the biggest one that people said is that sense of dignity and worth of all. When we can reconnect with our core values, we're able to reestablish our own sense of grounding and be less reactionary and able to respond more, because I am responding from this place of, respect, being calm under pressure, and these other core values and strengths, which might lead to greater sense of right action or wise action, so that I might seek information to understand. I'm able to feel a sense of responsibility and control, and I will fight like crazy for a child in court, that advocating assertively to set boundaries as I need to. And someone mentioned last week that sometimes all we can do is maintain a strong relationship with that child. And so having a safety plan for in the moment can be very beneficial to know, what am I going to do when that trigger situation comes up? And then, of course, the self-care plan are all the things that you already mentioned, things that you do to take care of yourself on a regular basis. So as I have found, having a safety plan, especially to support somebody else in de-escalating, is really, really helpful. If I come across a really angry person, or a parent or caregiver who's angry with me, and I know that happens quite a bit in our work. So something to think about to do over this next week would be to write down something that would be a self-care or safety strategy that you can practice in the next week. Again, that safety plan is all about, what are you going to do in the moment to put that armor on and to respond consistent with your core values, and to be able to have that assertive action, boundary setting, and to support somebody else, if that's what it is. And then the regular kind of self-care plan. What are you going to do around that? Next week, we're going to be talking about cultivating resilient teams. Part of the information I'll be bringing is about the sanctuary model, which is an organizational change model in human services that was developed by a psychiatrist named Sandy Bloom, and talking about how we can provide support to each other using the seven sanctuary commitments, and perhaps a little bit of the appreciative inquiry that Alan brought up last week as well, which is another organizational change model that brings support to our teams. So I am going to wrap it up and turn it back over to you, Stacy.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Just a reminder again that we will be sending out CEUs via email, and feel free to email us if you have any questions. This webinar will be recorded and also sent out. So if you want to share it with anybody or watch again, feel free. And then there will just be a brief evaluation survey at the end here. If you'd be willing to take a moment to give us some feedback, we'd appreciate it. Steve mentioned next week we'll be discussing the sanctuary model. We hope you join us. You can register in the chat if you haven't already. And then also the Center for Practice Transformation we have been sending out their podcasts led by Steve. And so we just released one this Monday called Trust with Compassion. It's about 7 minutes long and a great meditation for those interested. So we have that link in the chat as well. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll hope to see you next week.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Alan, for that comment. I'm going to take a look at that.